Pat Pattinson is a professional turnaround practitioner specializing in the rehabilitation of distressed businesses with a success rate of more than 95% for all business rescue plans published to date. Pat's commitment to the practice of compliant and ethical turnaround practices is rooted in his passion for saving businesses, saving jobs, and providing the best possible outcome to all affected persons. The restructuring or rehabilitation of a distressed business is one of the toughest things someone can go through, and is often a process filled with more confusion and frustration than is truly necessary. And that's why Pat created this series of turnaround boot camps. The more people know about at least the basics of restructuring or rehabilitating businesses in distress, the more clarity they can bring to the process. This is only one episode in the series of boot camps. Be sure to follow Pat on LinkedIn so you can receive notifications of when registrations open for the next one.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to season break. This was the sixth episode in the series. We're going to take a bit of a season break after this before we have our in-person boot camp, and then we will catch up towards the end of the second part of the year with an additional 6 episodes. To start off with, as always, just a bit of a disclaimer. The information shared are my personal experiences that I have had in turnarounds and business rescues, and they do not represent any of the associations, bodies, or people that I work with or that I belong to. Today's topic is not going to be a very long one. It's not one that is that well known, and however, it does play a very important role in most business rescues. The concept of post-commencement finance and the alternatives to that. The specific alternative to traditional post-commencement finance that I'm going to share with you this morning is cigar butt investments. Now, cigar butt investment is a concept that was coined or popularized by Warren Buffett from Berkshire Hathaway. We all know Warren Buffett as an investor that believes in the long term. He believes in acquiring shares in companies and then holding those shares, equity, or stocks for the long term. However, in Warren's earlier years, when he started out as an investor, he had a different philosophy, and that is what is known as cigar butt investments. In simple terms, those of you who are familiar with smoking cigars know that you do not tip the ash, you keep the ash on as long as possible. And in the probably not modern days, but earlier years, it was a show of wealth how much of the cigar you actually leave in the ashtray before you abandon it. The cigar would then smolder out with the ash, and you would indicate to the rest of the people around you in the cigar lounge of your wealth as to how much of the cigar you leave behind. Now, that part that's left behind is referred to as the butt. And you would often find budging entrepreneurial cleaners, waiter staff, waiters, waitrons that would actually collect these cigars out of these ashtrays. They would clean them up, and they would actually have cigars left that they can sell to the not so wealthy. You would have an individual that comes in with a Romeo cigar, smoke half of it. The cigar itself is probably at that stage about $10 or $12. But once it's left in the ashtray, once this waiter person has cleaned it off, cut it off, he can sell it into a market that cannot perhaps afford the $10 or $12, but that can afford $3 or $4. For the waiter, that's $3 or $4, probably the equivalent to 2 or 3 hours of labor. To the person that's buying it, he still has a show of wealth because of the fancy cigar that he's got, and he's recognized for that. And no one needs to know that it was a butt sold out of an ashtray. And that's where the term comes from. It basically indicates that there could be profit left in something that someone else has discarded, something like a cigar butt. Now, before we carry on and we go into the concept of cigar butt investments, I just want to also touch on post-commencement finance. Post-commencement finance is possibly unique to South African law, but only as far as the term is considered. Distressed investing in America, for instance, has got a much longer history than what post-commencement finance have got. In fact, there's substantial legislation around distressed investments in the rest of the world, to the extent that there are complete acts written for distressed investment. There are distressed investors that purely invest into companies going through rehabilitation. Chapter 11 America, Safe Harbor would have been in business rescue in South Africa. That's how they make their living. Now, in South African law, you have to be careful when you borrow money into a financially distressed business. We have got reckless borrowing, reckless lending. It's not as simple as, yes, I know you're in distress, I know the risk, here's a bit of money, charge extra interest, maybe take a bit of equity. There are substantial risks involved, especially when the company now enters into financial distress, the zone of insolvency. It could be that that entire loan is seen prejudicial and it's reversed by a liquidator once it goes in there. However, Section 135 in business rescue, and remember, it's purely for companies in business rescue, provides a little bit of additional protection, a little bit of security for any person or entity that's prepared to assist with funding into a business in business rescue. You can take security on assets as long as that particular asset is not already secured to someone else. You then need to consider things like your Nuntuk Pro rules, your Nemo Plus Euros, and a whole array of other things that we're not going to go into this morning. But if that asset is unsecured, you are able to take security on that asset. However, in my experience, as soon as you have that security and you present your secured claim, there's this utopia idea that I'm going to get absolutely all of my money because I've got the security. We must remember that the security that you've got is only over that asset. So let's go back to the example of the cigar. Your cigar might be worth $12, 120 Rand, 200 Rand. At an auction that results from a liquidation, that cigar is sold for 2 or 3 Rand. That is what you then get. Your security only extends to the value received on a liquidation auction for that specific asset. And then, of course, the liquidator will take his portion before you get anything. The master will take a smaller portion as part of the bigger picture, and the liquidator will take his portion, and then what's left will go to you as a secured claim. The rest of your claim, should there be any left, moves automatically to the concurrent claims. That's, of course, unless you have decided that you will perfect or renege on the additional debt being owed, because there could be a risk of a cost contribution. Now, this is a lot to be considered for post-commencement finance and the securities, and that's not the topic of today. That's why I'm skimming through this. I'm only highlighting it. What is of the topic today is, of course, cigar butt investments and post-commencement finance. Here I would like to share one of an example where I've used this very successfully many winters ago. A small engineering business, we're not going to use the name, we're going to call it Me Too Engineering, because it was a simple, often referred to as a mom, excuse me, often referred to as a moms and pops business, started by 4 friends, equal shareholders, all 4 of them directors, each one having his specific purpose within the business. They had a niche market in the boating and fishing industry, where they would repair specifically your aluminium, your stainless steel, those type of items that goes out in your boating, your chocker boating, sailboating, that type of thing. A very niche market. It was a good business. Their shareholders had a nice life for a very long period of time, but they also suffered from the Pareto principle. Pareto principle, of course, 80% of your business comes from 20% of your clients. One of their clients then decided that they no longer wished to do business with the Me Too Engineering, and they lost a substantial portion of the income. Immediately, not a big risk. The business could carry on. The business could carry on profitably. A little bit of restructuring would have been necessary, but the loss of this big client resulted in substantial infighting between the 4 shareholders, to the extent that 3 of the shareholders and obviously directors exited from the business, but only in job title and only in function. They kept earning salaries. They kept earning benefits, and they kept possession of the three lucrative or expensive vehicles that they had as directors of the business. The poor shareholder that remained obviously could not continue trading. He could not make enough money to cover all of these expenses. He did not have the heart to go up against his friends. Tried to get a bigger overdraft for the business, and this application for the bigger overdraft backfired, and the bank started investigating the current affairs of the business. They looked at the annual financial statements, they looked at the profitability, and it became very clear to them that the business is not in a position to even cover its existing exposure to the bank. It can't pay for all four vehicles. It can't pay for the assets that was financed, not even close to paying for an additional overdraft or for additional lending. The bank then proceeded with their Section 129 letters of demand, and they started the liquidation process. Fortunately for the business, fortunately for myself, even more fortunately for the bank, I just finished a different project with the bank, and they asked me to have a look at this business because they knew that this was not really at the fault of the directors or the shareholders. And unlike what most people think, the bank is not just there to close businesses down. I sat with the bank, I sat with the owners, I sat with the attorneys who obviously favored the liquidation because that's where they would make money. And we came up with an alternative to the immediate and traditional liquidation. The bank would not provide additional funding. However, they would give us 60 days to fix whatever we can within the business, to prepare a proper prospectus for the business, not a turnaround plan. They were not remotely interested in business rescue or a turnaround. The only way out for us was then to find a buyer within the next 30 days. They've basically gave the business 90 days, no funding, with a mandate to find a buyer. If a buyer could not be secured in this 90 days, the liquidation would proceed. What made this difficult is that although the three shareholders whom have left had the vehicles and they had salaries, we could not sell those vehicles to create an income for the business because, as I previously said, they were already bonded to the bank. Vehicle and asset finance, the bank holds security over that asset that they financed. We then took a bit of a cigar butt approach. We looked at what was in the business. The business was greatly undervalued because at a liquidation, and the valuation is obviously done at a liquidation scenario, all of the assets, all of the vehicles would be sold on an auction where you get substantially less for it. A liquidation auction also does not really provide for future business. It does not really allow for the collection of debt, and it most definitely does not allow for experience that the business had, for goodwill, for anything like that. The business had an exceptional reputation in the industry that it played in. The debt was far more than assets based on liquidation scenario. The clients were not sufficient to generate enough income for the business to run at a profit with its current exposure. So, in all intents and purposes, based on the liquidation scenario, not a viable business. However, when we looked at the economies of scales, we looked at what kind of investors we would look at, what kind of buyers we would look at, how we could restructure it. Part of our prospectus that went out to only 3 potential buyers included the resignation of the other shareholders, the relinquishing of their shares, and the surrender of the vehicles. Ultimately, each of the 3 directors were in a position to purchase their own vehicles. They were able to settle with the bank, and that reduced the exposure to the business. The investor that eventually purchased the business was much stronger and much bigger than our moms and pops business or the Me Too business. They looked at the economies of scales, where they would not need the premises that the business was currently located in. And the landlord knew that should the business go into liquidation, he's not going to be able to get a new tenant for quite some time. So a 3-month notice period was agreed with the landlord from the buyer, who obviously were in a position to give guarantees as far as the payments are concerned. They no longer needed additional telephone lines, internets. Unfortunately, they did not need additional secretary or even the financial department for debtors and creditors. However, the rest of the business, the machinery, the remaining staff, the remaining director, and the clients had enough value for this potential buyer to not settle with the bank, but based on his own credibility and strength, entered into payment terms with the bank where they would resettle and restructure the debt over a period of time. He brought all of the other debt up to date, and the business was thus purchased without any of the shareholders receiving anything for the business. But it could continue trading. The bank would be guaranteed of their payment. The landlord was in a position to exit and get a new tenant into it, and the all parties had a better outcome than that of immediate and traditional liquidation. So that is basically a cigar butt investment. There was not a great business to sell, but there was enough value in this business for what would have been an opposition entity, an opposition to this business, to make an offer of a nature that would suit all of the invested parties. And that is what a cigar butt investment is. So when we look at business rescue, and this is also important to consider when we talk about cigar butt investments and alternative forms of rescuing a business and post-commencement finance. In terms of the Companies Act, a business rescue practitioner are provided with two main tools to restructure the business. I'm obviously not talking about Section 133, the protection against legal actions and everything else. I'm purely talking about settling the debt. You could enter into a new repayment period where you might have had an account that should have been settled in 30 days. You might have a landlord that's supposed to be paid up front. You owe them for 4, 5, 6 months. However, instead of having to pay this debt right now in terms of a Section 129 letter of demand or an ordinary course of business, a practitioner could ring-fence all the historic debt and provide a compromise offer to pay this debt 100 cents in the rand over a 12, 24, 36-month period, whatever is reasonable. The second option available to a practitioner is to compromise that debt, where they are saying, we do not have sufficient funds to pay you right now. However, I can pay you 50, 60, 70 cents in the rand right now, and we write off the rest of the debt, and you as a creditor can then not pursue the remaining part. Again, we're ignoring personal sureties for now. That's a substantial topic for a later debate. The best thing when you want to look at an organic business rescue is to do a combination of the two. I am going to pay you your debt over 6 months, but only at 50 cents in the rand. Alternatively, I can do it over 12 months at 70 cents in the rand, etc., etc. The examples goes on. And it's all what the creditors believe to be palatable for their specific conditions. Keeping in mind, Section 128, 1B III of the Companies Act provide a better outcome than that of immediate and traditional liquidation. Now, when we consider immediate and traditional liquidation, the better result does not have to be monetarial. It doesn't have to mean that I can get 70 cents in the rand instead of the 50 cents in the rand. I have successfully been able to argue that although the creditors in a business rescue scenario would only receive 70 cents in the rand versus a possible 80 cents in the rand in a liquidation scenario, the liquidation scenario would have cost the jobs of about 140 staff members. Considering that benefit, considering the benefit of keeping people employed, it was a better outcome to go with the business rescue plan, although the creditors would have received slightly less than what they would have in a liquidation. That particular business rescue plan, where I offered less than in liquidation, was voted and adopted by creditors with 100%, with very little debates. Everybody understood that these families also needed to generate an income. Ladies and gentlemen, obviously there are other forms of post-commencement finance available. It's not just cigar butt investments. It's not just pure lending from the banks. In fact, in South Africa, the banks is almost a last point of call. I have had great success with several banks. I'm not putting them down. It is just very difficult. And the difficulty does not go in as far as getting the funds from the bank. I'm not saying that's easy. The problem comes in with timing. The banks have got substantial needs, substantial paperworks. They need a lot of information. They need to have committee meetings before they can actually okay post-commencement finance. And unfortunately, in business rescue, we do not always have the luxury of time. What I have done successfully in the past, I secure post-commencement finance from a couple of smaller providers, lenders, creditors, suppliers, on condition that should we secure the funding from the bank, I would settle those smaller lenders. This is obviously done with the acknowledgement of the bank. It's part of our proposal. It's part of our ask. It is just a simpler process to have the bank to repay rather than have a group of smaller creditors that is added into the business rescue. What also does make post-commencement finance difficult is the fact that, let's call, the bank provides capital into a business rescue, but they do not have a vote into that business rescue plan that relates to the additional post-commencement finance you provided. Now, remember, when a business rescue plan is presented, the creditors vote on that plan, and the business rescue practitioner and the company must receive a vote of no less than 75% in favor of the business rescue plan, directly proportional to the debt owed by the creditors that are present at their meeting and that exercised their votes. So if the bank or any lender provided post-commencement finance and that debt were to be added to the vote, they would have secured additional voting interest. Unfortunately, they don't have that. They do not increase their vote. So the possibility of the business rescue plan being rejected is there. And again, that's what makes it so difficult to receive post-commencement finance before business rescue plan is published. However, we have a chicken and egg scenario where no one wants to provide or no one wants to vote for a business rescue plan unless the post-commencement finance is provided. It could be contingent, but we've seen many times in the past where post-commencement finance is secured in a business rescue plan, but it simply never materializes, making the rescue an impossibility. Supplier funding is something that I have successfully done in the past. We have got projects, we have got work. We go to a supplier and say, Mr. Supplier, we can't pay you unless we can produce XY products. We can't produce XY products unless you not just provide us with the material that we need, but please, hat in hand, how about a little bit of funding? How about paying for us to actually do this job so that we can supply it to our client? There's obviously negotiations and talks between the supplier, our client, and ourselves in order to provide the required security. Similarly, you might have a client that normally we used to purchase on a 30-day account. You then don't just ask them to pay COD, but you actually ask for a deposit up front. And if you're open and honest about it, and if your product is important enough, that's not normally a problem. Co-op funding, I've used this once or twice before. It's very difficult to put together, but this is where you actually have funding in the form of a cash injection coming from your staff, your shareholders, family, spouse, suppliers, customers. Everybody provides funding into the business for a certain portion of equity. That equity is then run by a trust, and a trust make sure that we repay the fund, or alternatively, they keep the shares in the business and they rely on the dividends going forward. Very, very difficult and technical to put together, but we have done that successfully in the past. One of my favorite forms of securing financing is where we use what's called project-based funding. It holds all of the protections, all of the securities for a funder as per Section 135 of the Companies Act with the post-commencement finance, but we actually secure it. We provide the security in the form of a specific order. I need 20 widgets in order to produce this particular product that's going to go to company A. I get these 20 widgets from supplier X. Supplier X will give it to me on condition that supplier A actually pays for the full proceeds into his bank account. He will then take the money for his 20 widgets and pay us the difference. Thereby, the risk does not lie with the company and business rescue, but it actually lies with the strength of our client. Again, transparency plays a vital role there, but I have used it very successfully in a lot of business rescue processes in the past. And even outside of business rescue, we were able to secure this from a lot of our suppliers and for our clients. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this morning. I want to put a special thanks to those who have viewed these little Friday morning boot camps. This is, of course, the 6th in the series. As I've mentioned earlier, we're going to take a bit of a break. We're going to plan an in-person boot camp. Just keep an eye out on LinkedIn and Facebook and all the other social media platforms. Book your seat, and we will be talking about everything that was covered in the last 6, as well as those in the next 6, with regards to business rescue and the rehabilitation of financially distressed companies. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a good weekend.